Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Watts and I'm looking forward to spending the next 60 or so minutes with you talking about re-entry. You'll go away from this webinar with some things that you can do to ensure that you finish well in your host country and leave with no regrets, but also with some idea of what is up ahead for you as you go home. Hopefully some realism, but also some excitement about the possibilities and for creating a new you through your transition of re-entry. While we're just waiting for a few more folks to join, please do make sure you've got a pen and paper to hand to write things down that we talk about, which you'll find useful later on. Hopefully you can hear me, you can see the PowerPoint I've loaded up. Do go ahead and type into that chat box so that I know that you're here. I'll be checking that from time to time through the chat. Yay, somebody can hear me. I'm getting some of these messages through. Neil and I are here and can see you. Brilliant. Doreen, you can hear and see. Fantastic. Great. I'm getting a number of you here. Can hear, but I can't see much else in the intro slide. That's fine. It's just an intro slide at the moment. That's okay. We'll get there. We'll be moving on in a minute. It's good to know that you are there. So just what would be really helpful for me is to just know a little bit about where you're coming from. If I manage to get the slide to move. So to get to know you a little bit. Where are you currently? Where are you returning to? And how long have you been away? If you can just chat and put very briefly in the chat box those things. Where are you currently? Where are you returning to? And how long have you been away? If you've been in lots of different places, feel free to type all of those in or just the last one. It's up to you. As I said, I'm the only one here, so I will be checking the chat now and again to see if there's anything I'd like to comment on or questions that need answering. There's sometimes a little bit of a delay of the chat coming through, so bear with me on that one if I swap about a little bit. Great, some more of you coming through. It's Deborah, she can hear and see. Brilliant. So are any of you feeling somewhat overwhelmed with the whole finishing up and not knowing what to expect when you leave at the moment? It's very normal to feel all over the place when you're in the midst of re-entry. And as we'll be talking about in a moment, you've already started off into your re-entry transition the moment you decide to plan towards going home or had that decision made for you. I'm going to use the word home throughout this webinar simply because it's easier than always saying passport country or the place you're going back to or any other such convoluted phrase. I'm aware some of you probably have mixed feelings about the concept of home, but I'm going to cut down on words tonight, so I'm going to use that one if that's okay. Right, while I'm waiting for some of your hellos and things to come through, I'm going to go ahead and just share a little bit of my own story so that you know how I come to be talking with you about re-entry. So the first time that I went overseas was to Germany as a student. I was studying mechanical engineering, and the third year of my course took me to study further in Hanover in northern Germany, and I loved it. The courses were more interesting than back in the UK. I loved the food, the people, got totally immersed in German culture, involved in various student groups and a local church choir. I lived in an international dorm, but spent most of my time with Germans. The culture was so similar to who I felt I was, that I just felt like I blended in and was more fully me than when I was in the UK. People did warn me that coming back might not be easy. And I was very apprehensive about leaving, despite knowing I would be back in the same city as my boyfriend at the time. And it was tough. I had another year of my course to finish back in the UK, and it took me most of that time to feel like I'd settled back into life in the UK. A few years later, having married Duncan and both of us with a vision for working overseas and not getting caught up in the rat race in the UK, but wanting to do something meaningful, we left for Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. We were determined to make a difference and serve people in whatever way we could. So we initially did a development course, all related to helping other people own their growth and see for themselves their own needs and act on them, rather than us telling them what we thought those were. We loved it, but we didn't have a chance to put it into practice as a team conflict led us to resigning and leaving after less than 2 years. So this time re-entry was pretty sudden. Having resigned, our organisation then gave us a week or so to pack up and leave. It was all we could do to say goodbye to those we'd got to know and then get on a plane. We landed back in the UK confused and not knowing where things were going or how long it was going to take us to find another organisation to go back with. only to be met at the airport by someone doing a survey. We thought, you know, what's the harm in answering a few questions? Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you do? By which point we told the lady that she'd better find somebody else. During that re-entry, Duncan suffered from depression for a while, and it was a strange situation as we knew that we wanted to go back, and it was only a matter of waiting until we could and going through the red tape of sorting things out. Our minds and hearts were still in Kyrgyzstan, while our feet were in the UK. It meant that we never properly felt settled, always only felt we were passing through. When we eventually went back, it was to a remote, isolated town 5 hours outside the capital city. I was in the early days of being a mum and had quite an identity crisis of who I was and what I offered to the world apart from mummy brain. I did a whole mixture of things, from putting up a wind turbine in a local collective farm where they had no electricity, running parenting courses. This was my last parenting course that I ran with the young mums, my children there in the front. Homeschooling, mentoring short-term workers. But after 4 years in that location, we got to the point where it was the time to return. A whole host of reasons, but wanting to retrain was one of them. And before we left, we lived through a revolution that started in the town that we were based in and spread throughout the country. Left all the prisoners from the jails running riot in town, gunmen shooting randomly in the streets, and a personal threat from someone who wanted to buy our house but couldn't. We left in 2010, our children 6 and 4 at the time. We prepared ourselves well for returning. We read a number of books on re-entry, left on good terms with those around us. And when we got back, we found that people weren't really interested in what we'd been doing. And people we'd considered friends before, or when we were back for a visit, had moved on. Or we'd changed so much that we couldn't relate anymore. We were thoroughly overwhelmed by the number of decisions we had to make, from big things like careers, down to the mundane like new toilet seats. We realised, though, that we had the opportunity to shape the next stage of our lives in a way that many people who stay put just don't. We could shape our future by taking time to work out where next, and by setting goals which we step by step move towards. It made a massive difference to our feeling settled. I spent a couple of years once we got back struggling with depression, which was a culmination of a lot of stresses piling on top of each other, but I've learned a lot in coming through that. And I do have a passion, making re-entry easier for other people, and helping them to make the most of the opportunity presented by re-entry to reevaluate life. So I've got some more messages coming through, so I'm just going to check those. That's brilliant. Great. So Deborah has been in Kolkata, India, going back to Canada after 5 years. Welcome, Deborah. Alison, currently in London, been here for 7 years, but was in Switzerland 2 years previously. We're moving back to Washington, DC. Been away for almost 10 years when I return in July. Welcome, Alison. Doreen, moved back already. 7 countries, 4 continents. You know the story, I do. Welcome, Doreen. Neil and Penny, been in Tunisia, leaving on June the 21st. It was coming up soon. Returning to near Oxford in the UK after 10 years abroad. Brilliant. Okay. Somebody lost me, going to re-enter the room. If you do get thrown off at any point, then it's worth just reloading the page. As others join, I'm sure there'll be others in there as well. So to today's session, where are we? An overview. We're going to spend some time looking at finishing well, how to make sure you leave your host country positively and bring closure before moving on. So this will involve practical things you can do, as well as some food for thought and reflection that you can usefully do before you leave. After that, we'll think more about what you're going to face in going home, what to expect, some thoughts about culture shock, relating to people, and giving yourself permission for various things during this time. For some of you, this webinar will be just what you need to know. For others, you might feel that you actually would like some support in the process, or really want the opportunity to redesign yourself as you go through re-entry and would like some help with that. So if it's okay with you then, towards the end of the call, I'd like to share with you where you can get further support as you settle and what that might look like so you can make the most of your transition. Just before we look up at finishing where you are then, I'd like to say a word about your journey. This is a diagram, or something similar, that we were shown when we came back in 2010. I found it so helpful because it tied in with my own experience of feeling like life was in chaos. This diagram can be used when you go abroad as well as when you come back. But for the sake of argument here, let's take the left-hand side as where you are once you're settled in your host country. So over here, you're settled, you're adjusted, you're contributing, you're involved. You've probably got some sort of a role, you're adjusted to being there and contributing to the community around you. You've got status and reputation, whatever that might look like. Maybe it could be being an expat mum. Maybe it's being the tough ones in an isolated location. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's just being an expat. But whatever it is, it provides you with a sense of identity, knowing where and how you fit. Then at some point, the decision to leave is made. If this is made for you, maybe forced upon you, it's all the harder because then there's often little time for the goodbyes and finishing up that comes next. Assuming though that you made the decision and then have a year or 6 months to start thinking about going home, once you make that decision, life is never the same again. There's a guy called Jerry Jones from the Culture Blend who said in one of his great blog posts, "Now you're no longer a newbie or a stayer, but a goer." Have you noticed how people's attitude towards you has changed since you announced that you were going to be leaving? Some distance themselves from you a bit. Others want to spend as much time as possible together before you leave. Yet others want all your stuff very cheaply. When you make that decision to leave, that is when the chaos of re-entry starts. That's when your identity and rootedness start to be shaken. It isn't just in getting back that this stuff happens. It starts before you ever leave. Does anyone resonate with that? Have you started to feel that already? So, you're in the chaos phase. By the time you actually leave, it's full on, if it wasn't already. If you've been kicked out of somewhere and given a few days to leave or had a medical emergency, it's all a complete whirlwind. But even if you've had longer, it means you've had more of a chance to fill your head up with to-do lists, right? So, if at all possible, I would recommend moving out of your current housing a few weeks before you actually leave. That way the packing is done and sorted and you can focus up on finishing up well. We had a month in the capital city after packing up our house in Talas. And despite the fact that Duncan was running a conference during that time, it meant that our exit was much more relaxed. I realise it's not realistic for everyone, but if it is possible, do consider it. Then you'll be getting on that plane. This is where a boat would have been so much better. Even 40 or 50 years ago, you would have gone home on a boat and taken 4 to 6 weeks to do it, if not longer. So you don't have a boat, but you do have the possibility of going on holiday somewhere on the way home. Tip 1 from this webinar. Write this down. Take time out on your way home. If you're currently in a third world country, try to find somewhere that is more developed than where you are now, but possibly not as much as home. A sort of halfway house. But whatever, 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, even 2 weeks. After all the packing's done, after all those traumatic goodbyes, it's worth having time out before the hellos hit. It gives you space to process a bit and say goodbye internally before you get into re-entry proper. Okay, so finishing well. Moving on to the next slide. There we go. Now, I've just told you to go somewhere on a holiday, but before you even get that far, I'd like you to build a raft. Not that I'm suggesting you go on holiday on a raft. You'll understand in a moment. In fact, you possibly already do if you read anything on re-entry. A really important aspect of starting again somewhere new, or somewhere old if you're going back somewhere familiar, is to finish well, to bring closure, to end the chapter. Penny's just said, we will come by boat and car. Sounds good. Gives you a bit of extra time. So to end a chapter. Now, some people are very good at goodbyes and others are particularly bad at it. Let me encourage you to learn to be good at it. It's really important. Have I said that yet? It's really important. In order for something new to start, something has to end. In order for something to end, you need to recognize fully that it is ending and not just walk away without acknowledging the importance it has held for you. So one of the ways of making sure you do the ending well is a useful little acronym like RAFT. Let me tell you what it stands for, and then let's walk through it. So, RAFT, we've got reconciliation, affirmation, farewells, and thinking ahead. Let's do a little work on this. Reconciliation. The main questions you have to ask yourself here are who and why. Actually, we could probably add a what to that, but we'll come on to that. So chances are there are some people with whom you have unfinished business in your current location. People with whom you've had conflict of some sort, small or large. People whom you're now avoiding or whom you just tolerate. Have a think. Are there any people like this in your life? Bosses, fellow expats, a home help, work colleagues? Write them down. These broken relationships can actually go on to affect you when you leave them far behind, either through bitterness, frustration, regret, guilt. There are many ways which they can continue to have a hold on you. It's worth addressing them now so that while you have the chance, they can be laid to rest. Or at least you can know you have done all that you physically can do. So, have you got a list of people that you have had some sort of conflict with, even if only in the smallest way? Perhaps you've just got one or two. Great. Doesn't matter how many it is. But spend a minute or two just thinking, what prompted the disagreement? Why are they on your list? And what could you do to bring closure? Maybe it's just enough to acknowledge them in your head and say that wasn't so good. Maybe you need to say sorry while you can, face to face. Maybe a letter or an email would be enough. Offer forgiveness. The time we left after the team conflict, we did our utmost to make sure we were reconciled to our team leader with whom the problems were before we left. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant, but we left knowing we had done what we could from our side to bring closure to the relationship. It made a big difference to us afterwards. So does that give you something to work towards for reconciliation? The other thing I would say on this one is that in the heat of packing up and leaving and all the stress that ensues there, it's easy for harsh words to be said or irritations to occur. Again, in that, keep your accounts short. Say sorry as soon as possible. Hug, make up. I had a client recently who had an argument with someone just as she was leaving, and it coloured the whole of her first year back because she desperately didn't want to have left like that. And through the coaching process that we took together, she was able to acknowledge how much pain that had caused her, and actually eventually had the chance to redress that relationship and make it good, which was great because not everybody has that opportunity. I've just seen something come in from Doreen. Our mid-step return to the US was in France. We cycled across Provence. Fun, but very hot by the sounds of it. Yeah, it's great to have that place in the middle where you can stop off. So reconciliation, that's the first step of building our raft. On to affirmation then. I've got the same two questions for you here. In fact, three again, probably. Who and why? Take a moment to think and jot down. Who would you like to thank for being a part of your time abroad? Who would you like to encourage or to acknowledge for their part in your journey? There can often be people that you meet in your first few weeks in country who are just so helpful in showing you around, introducing you to other people or listening to your culture shock or lostness, who you then don't necessarily spend much time with afterwards, but they were still there and a good and really helpful part of your journey. Of course, there are other people sprinkled all the way through and people who you've become really close to. Write some names down, people you would like to acknowledge, especially for those who perhaps don't really know what they did for you or how important it was. Maybe there are teachers of your kids as well that you were impressed with. What is it that you would like to affirm or thank or encourage them for? Why have they popped up on your radar now as we think about this? Again, you can carry away regret with you for not having passed on a kind word or said what you really wanted to say to someone. So plan it. Be intentional, and don't, whatever you do, leave it till the last minute, or it won't happen because other things have a tendency to get in the way. Just take a moment now, just think, who are the people you really want to acknowledge and say something to before you leave, or write something to, or email. I'll just give you a moment to write those people down. Great. So on to the next one then. We've done our reconciliation, affirmation. We're on to farewells. This time I think there are 4 or more categories you can break things into. This is what I was talking about at the beginning of this section when I mentioned the importance of goodbyes. Who are the people that you definitely don't want to leave without saying goodbye to? Write them down. Again, don't leave this to the last minute. Depending on what sort of a culture you're in, you don't know which neighbours or others will demand your time and your precious last hours. So don't bank on it being your favourite friends. Who are those people that you definitely don't want to leave without saying goodbye to? Bear in mind here with this one that grief is an intensely personal thing. Some people cry heaps in the run-up to leaving. I was one of those. Every time I saw people that I knew I would likely not see again, I would cry. This is sometimes referred to as pre-grieving, and that's okay, and it's good and it's healthy. Some people seem to manage to get through all their goodbyes without a tear shed, and when they get on the plane or arrive the other end, they can be overcome with the loss, or even much further down the line. This is called post-grieving. And again, everyone does it in their own way. Some people don't cry at all either end, and that's okay too. What I'm wanting to get across is that everything here is normal. And do let others grieve in their own way too. Just because you're crying when you say goodbye to a close friend doesn't mean that they will. And it doesn't mean that they love you any less because they're not crying. So just be aware of other people when you're grieving as well. So people, it's really important to say goodbye to people, but not just people, places. Which places have been special to you while you've been there? Which would you like to visit again before you leave? There were some amazing places which we had been to, which we knew we would never go back to, but others, like a place we often went to for picnics in the forest that we revisited shortly before we left. You can even make some sort of ritual up to do in these places to say goodbye. Have a bit of silence. Offer some prayers. Thank the place for its place in your life. Perhaps that sounds silly to you. I'm just suggesting different ways of marking the ending. Take those that are useful and bin the rest. But mark those places which have been special to you. Make sure you've got photos of them. Pets. Make sure you find the opportunity to say goodbye to the pets or the animals who've been part of your life, the ones that you're not able to take with you. This can be especially important for children, but I don't think adults are immune either. And possessions. Are there things you need to part with which you'll miss having as part of your everyday? Some people live very lightly and things take very little or no importance, but to others they're much more valued than that. Take a moment to write down the possessions that you will have to leave behind that you'll miss. Perhaps you don't know yet because you haven't started packing, but bear it in mind when you do. Our house in Talas was really special to us. It was a bigger house than we're ever going to be able to afford in the UK, and a place where we felt very, very safe. I'm not one for being tied to things per se, but it was really hard leaving that house with its walls made of mud, its outdoor toilet, lovely fruit trees in the garden, and the sauna, but I won't mention that. So lots to think about in farewells. What else comes up for you as you start thinking about saying or enacting goodbye? Do give notice to those emotions that arise and let them be. Don't judge them. Just watch them arise and allow them to be. There are no wrong emotions. Just give you a moment in case there's other things you need to write on that list of people, places, pets, and possessions. Okay, we've almost finished building our raft. The final step is to think destination. I'm not talking practical stuff here. You'll be doing a lot of that anyway. I'm talking expectations, hopes, and desires. Part of reverse culture shock, which we'll be coming on to shortly, is related to our expectations of going home. So you can preempt some of that by thinking in advance about what is going on in the back of your mind as you prepare to go home. What are your expectations, your hopes, and your desires for re-entry, for friends, for family? Which friendships have you been able to maintain while you've been away? What hopes have you got for picking those up again? How are relationships within and with your extended family? And indeed, what expectations might they have of you? Just have a think and jot some things down. Again, I'm going to give you a moment just to think about those things And sometimes you don't actually know what your expectations are until you go and you find that something's been not met. But in as far as you know them at the moment, see if you can jot down 1 or 2 hopes, desires, expectations for your new location. How are you getting on? I won't allow too much space, otherwise you'll wonder where I've got to. I'm now going to ask another question. How realistic are these expectations, these hopes and desires? Again, you might not fully know, but even asking the question might take the edge off the disappointment if things don't work out as you've hoped. How realistic are those things that you've written down? Any questions on what I've covered so far? Do feel free to write something in the chat box. By the way, it's really, really important that you do each of these steps for with your children too, if you have them. They'll have different people in their lives who they need to say sorry to or affirm. And it's key that they do those things, whatever age they are. Make sure you think well about what goodbyes they need to make, to whom and to what. Often the things that the children want to say goodbye to seem so inconsequential in our eyes, but they're actually really, really important to them. And talk to them about what they're going to, especially if this will be their first real time living in your home country. Again, it's not their home country, it's your home country, but it's not theirs. If you can find folk back home who can help your children with fashion or catch them up on TV programs, then so much the better. If you'd like some more exercises to help you finish well, I have a free set of emails on my website that you can sign up for, which will lead you through Raft, but also some other things that you can do in preparation. So feel free to sign up for those, and they'll give you a series of emails every few days as you prepare to go home. So on to the next part then. Looking forward to going home. Okay, some basics. Going back home is very much like going overseas in the first place. I'm sure you must have looked into culture shock and what that looks like. Have you ever seen this curve before? It depicts your adjustment over time to a new location. When you first arrive, you go through a honeymoon period when everything seems so exciting and fun. This gradually wanes into a period of culture shock when the things that you first found so exciting irritate you and you wish you were somewhere else. And then slowly you adjust until it becomes a new normal. Familiar? Presumably. Well, coming back is very like that. You go through the same sorts of phases. Initially, it can all be great. Seeing family and friends who you've been starved of, tasting those foods that you've missed, finding that water comes straight out of the tap when you turn it on and not just in a dribble. All these things are great and exciting when you first come back. Then slowly you start to see things about your home culture that you hadn't seen before. Things that you don't like and find irritating. The job search comes. Finances don't quite reach that so far. Family want to see you more often or aren't showing any interest at all. And so the low comes, and it takes a while for home to truly become home again. Remember, this is just a picture of what happens. I think in reality, it's a lot more up and down like that, quite like a roller coaster. But it's the general idea. Now, I don't want to shock or scare you, but depending on how long you've been away and how immersed you've been in a culture, in my experience, it takes about 18 months to start to feel more settled back at home. It's not always that long, and indeed it can be longer. Now, from where you're standing, that probably sounds like a very long time. But think about how long it took you to feel at home in your host culture when you first left your home country. I'd be very surprised if any of you felt truly at home after a couple of months. Can anyone here claim that? Respect if that's the case. The fact is that living overseas changes us, mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, politically, spiritually, in fact, in so many ways. If you're from the States, you might notice that the political changes are what really get you more than some people from other places in the world. From what I've seen of Americans returning, they have the hardest time dealing with the news feed which comes from their media after living abroad. But there'll be different things for everybody who's going back to different countries that they struggle with. You're not the person you once were, and you're going back to a country which in some ways has stayed the same, but in some ways has moved in different directions which you've not been part of. But you're going back as a fundamentally different person. One way to describe this is with a great illustration from my friend Naomi Hathaway. She, if you Google her name, Naomi Hathaway, and I am a triangle, you'll find her original article on this subject, which is brilliant. She says to imagine that you come from circle country on the left-hand side of the diagram. Yeah, so you're a circle coming from circle country, and you travel abroad to live or to work, and you go to square society. Here, everyone is different to your folks back home. They're shaped differently. They look at the world differently. You live there for a period of time, start to adjust to living there, and over time you actually find that you're not quite as round as you once were. In fact, you're starting to get corners. But you don't become a square because you're not that shape either. In fact, you've become a triangle. No problem. You know you're different to square society, so it really doesn't matter that much. You're still different, but you feel a bit more adjusted. Then for whatever reason, life takes you back to circle country, where you came from originally. Big relief. You won't stick out anymore. You know what to expect and can fit in. Or can you? Actually, you're a triangle now, and not a circle. So it's just like trying to live as a circle in square society. You're different. Does that make sense? The likelihood is that even though we'll adjust given time, we will never feel totally at home in our home country again. We will always be that little bit different. Please don't let that be off-putting, but be comforted when you find it tough to know that that is what has happened. So where does that leave children of expats who've been brought up overseas and yet have parents from a different culture? Well, Naomi reckons they're star-shaped. I like that. My children are stars. So the reason for giving you that illustration is partly to give you words to describe what you are going through, or will be going through. And it might help others back home if you can describe it to them like that too. But partly also to encourage you to treat your repatriation not as going back somewhere familiar, but as starting over in a new destination. Yes, there will be some things, some people who are familiar, but if you can treat it like a new placement, then it won't grate as much as having a mindset that says it's just going home. Does that make sense? Yeah, comment from Dorian saying, yes, moving back to America and discovering it's nothing like we left and we want to run back to our old location. Well, yes, we've known that a lot of times. Okay, so moving on. I want to talk about people a little bit. People are funny things, aren't they? Love them, hate them. When I did a survey a couple of years ago about the greatest challenges that people face when repatriating, time and time again, top of the pile came people, friends and family. And time and again, the very same people were the greatest help too. We all need people, but because of being the triangle you are now, you're also going to feel pretty disconnected when you go home. We've already talked a little bit about expectations. If you're going to be living near to family when you return, maybe worth having that conversation with them before you return. What are they expecting of you? What are their hopes and dreams now that you're going to be back? Oh, that was family too, wasn't it? So next one is friends. Now, if you're headed back to a familiar town, you may well be looking forward to hooking up with old friends. This is a strange one. Have you found it interesting who's kept in touch while you've been away? Sometimes it's not the ones you expect to keep in touch you do, nor necessarily the ones you'd like to keep in touch. Likewise, when you go back, it's not always those that you expect that you will continue friendships with. There may be folk who have been great at keeping in touch while you've been gone, but when you come back, somehow you just don't connect with them anymore, or they don't show an interest in your life anymore. And there may be folk who barely kept in touch or not at all, who were bad at keeping in touch, or who were mere acquaintances before you left, who will now become closer friends. Coming back as a triangle means that every relationship has changed. It won't be as it was before. With some friendships, that will mean the end. They'll dwindle. And there may be new friendships emerging in places you didn't expect. I have to say that all of my close friends now are people that I didn't know from my time previously in Oxford, or people that were very much on the periphery then that I didn't know very much at all. So tip number 2 is hold your friendships lightly as you go back. Hold your friendships lightly. Try not to have massive expectations on who you're going to retake up friendships with, and be willing and open to look at new friendships. Last thing then about people is to give them grace. I think that little word grace sums up so much of what you need over this season. The people you're going back to have no idea on the whole what it is like to be a triangle, unless they've been one themselves, of course. They don't know how it feels, and they don't know what a different perspective on the world you now have. They can't know. It's foreign to them. They're just being who they are in the context in which they live as a result of the life they have known. They're just being who they are in the context in which they live as a result of the life they have known. They're not being deliberately obtuse, stupid, uncaring, or opinionated. Well, not mostly anyway. They just don't know. So give them grace. For those times when someone asks the question, how was, or I bet you're glad to be home, it's worth having a think about a short answer before you get back to give those sorts of openers so they don't floor you every time. Grace. Here's something else to think about. I run a Facebook group called Reentry / Repatriation Stories. Search it up. You're welcome to join. I'll give you a link to it on the last slide. I asked the question of them what they would have liked to have known before they went home. What would have been helpful? And one of the brilliant ideas someone came back with was this. Put together a crib sheet over your last few weeks in your host country. On one side, list the things that you will really miss. On the other side, put the things that you really won't miss, or the things that you will miss least, the things that really irritate you about your host culture, the things that make you angry. Here's my example. There's a few things I came up with. When you're deep in culture shock and hating being back home, reminiscing with rose-tinted glasses about your time abroad, it is sometimes good to have some perspective added by remembering the more challenging aspects of it too. It's all too easy to think that life was better then, but it was easier. The people were nicer. Take a moment now to scribble some things down and add to it until you leave. What things will you most miss? And what things will you least miss? But do make sure you don't get too cross with your host culture before you leave, because that's not helpful either. It's just about having a realism to it. What things will you most miss? And what things will you least miss? Do go ahead and add to those as the days go on, but I'm sure some things will have hit you straight away off the top of your head. So reverse culture shock hits in so many different ways for different people. For some, it's a sense of isolation. For others, walking into a supermarket prompts you to burst into tears and walk out again. At times, it's that feeling of being a British person or whatever you are on the outside, but really not being that on the inside, not knowing what others are expecting of you or what to do in any given situation. There are books about this stuff, and I would really recommend that you read some if you haven't. It's just as varied as culture shock in the first place. So rather than talking about it too much, I want to give you tip 3. And this is what somebody said to us. Tip 3 is expect the unexpected. It's never what we think will catch us off guard that actually does. It's the things that we haven't thought about. You may prepare yourself for finding it hard to make new friends, or for being overwhelmed by all the decisions you have to make, or for walking into a supermarket and walking straight out again. But it's quite likely to be, I don't know, that email from a dear friend back in your host country, or coming into an unknown situation that it could be what it is that sends you over the edge. Expect the unexpected. And when it hits, you know what? Give yourself grace. Recognize it as one of those situations that belong to culture shock and look after yourself in it. Do something nice for yourself. Have a good cry. It's okay. The other thing to note about that, especially those of you coming back as part of a family, is that you will all adjust at different rates. You'll grieve things differently and be hit by different things at different times. Give each other the space to express those things. Give each other grace. Help each other to communicate those things. I said we'd talk about giving yourself permission for various things. So here we go. Reentry is exhausting. Give yourself permission to rest, to take time out, to read a book, to be tired. Even a year in, some people still find living back in their home country tiring, possibly just like you did in adapting to a new culture. It's okay. It's normal. You're not going mad. You just need to give yourself some space. Give yourself permission to rest. And give yourself some grace too. Give yourself permission to be confused. Don't give yourself a hard time if you don't know all the answers. If you don't know where you're going next. If you get lost going round the corner. If you're struggling to know which way is up. It's okay. It's part of the journey. You don't have to have it all sorted. We expats like to think we're all organised, don't we? Masters of moving here, there and everywhere, packing a suitcase in 5 minutes, making decisions. Not so in re-entry. Give yourself some grace. On that note, try not to make any major decisions, at least for the first few weeks back. It's worth giving yourself more time to adjust. But give yourself permission to be confused. It's okay if your brain just doesn't seem to be working as fast as you think it should be. It often seems to go slow during re-entry. Now, we talked about this a little bit already. Some days will feel good and more settled, and others will feel like you're back to square one. Give yourself permission to ride that roller coaster of emotions that go with re-entry, to express the grief, whether loss of place, people, or status. Many people don't give credit to quite how much our identity changes when we leave a posting. We have this status as an expat, a traveller, a person for the hard places, and when we leave, suddenly we're nothing. We're not that anymore. That takes some grieving. It can feel very empty, and we can feel quite bereft at having been robbed of this identity. Give yourself some grace. And come across a lot of people who find suddenly that if they're not an expat, they don't know who they are. And I certainly associate with that when we first came back, feeling like, well, we'd been these people that everybody recognises as being development workers, and now suddenly we weren't that anymore. So who were we, and what was our vision, and where were we trying to go? It raises all sorts of questions in you. Give yourself permission to dream. What have you always wanted to do but haven't? What are the opportunities presenting themselves by going back home? Why not take this chance and use your re-entry as a stepping stone to something new? Maybe this is your chance to refashion yourself. Take that course you've dreamt of taking. Start over. Even if you end up doing something remarkably similar to what you've done so far, giving yourself the opportunity to dream can bring a completely different perspective to it and make it intentional rather than just something you've fallen into because it was there. Not many people have the chance to do that in their life, especially in the West, because life just gets so busy, doesn't it? And you don't actually have time to stop and think, actually, what do I want here? What's my next path? Give yourself permission to dream. Now, this is an interesting one. Money can be quite tight in an international move, can't it? But I would like you to give yourself permission to spend. Now is the time to take that course, to retrain, to get some support, to make your life easier, to work on who you are and what you really want out of life. Once you get into life back home, as we just talked about, these chances disappear as you get involved in the rat race and life overtakes. Take the opportunity to invest in yourselves. It'll be money well spent. So I think we're almost there. Are you still with me? I wanted to try and wrap this up by the hour, so I wanted to make sure that I fitted in any questions that you might have before then as well. So hopefully we'll be done in the next 15 minutes. Time for a final tip. Tip 4 then. Have I said this yet to you before? Give yourself and everyone around you major doses of, can you fill in the space? Grace. Give yourself some grace. Everyone you meet, give them some grace. It's really, really important. Now, I would so love to be able to give you 10 tips to make it really easy for you to get through re-entry and for it not to be a tussle and not to be tough. And I can't, because it doesn't work like that, and re-entry is difficult. But I can suggest ways to make the pain worthwhile. I can suggest to you that you take the bull by the horns in your repatriation and you really use it as an opportunity to refashion yourself, to dream, to find the new you. You can back away from the pain and you can just struggle through it and just kind of mosey on and fall into something. Or you can make the most of that and make the most of your international experiences. I would encourage you to do the latter. So up until now, what has been the most important thing you're going to take away from this call? Go ahead and write something down. What are you going to do as a result of this webinar, and what do you want to remember? If you write it down, they say you're 42% more likely to remember it and act on it. So write something down. What's been the most important thing that you're going to take away? If you want to write it in the chat box, do. As I mentioned earlier, for some of you, this is going to be more than enough to take away for now. For others of you, you already know that you want to take the opportunity of re-entry to redesign your life and start again. I'm going to briefly outline how you can do that, and then I'll take some questions to finish off the call, so do stay around for that. I'd like to offer you the chance to take advantage of my Repotting for Growth package. Now, this is a 6-month package, including one-on-one sessions with me to help you process your time overseas, to find confidence in who you are now that you're home, put in place the things that are most likely to help you feel settled and move towards thriving in your home country, designing the new you. I'll be giving you worksheets and tools to help you make the most of the process now, and that you can go on using for the rest of your life. And throughout that 6 months, you'll have unlimited email access to me that can go on for a while afterwards as you're still processing stuff as well. And this package is going to cost £357. Here's a quote from a recent client who took up this offer. Margaret said, "I needed someone to help me focus, regain perspective and control of my life, and get me moving forward. Things began to change immediately. I started coaching sessions with Helen. I came to see clearly the steps I needed to take to get life under control, and I came to understand myself better." She really worked with the stuff that I gave her, and it was amazing to see the change from the start to the end of my times with her. Now, if you'd like to take things even deeper, we can work more on your personality through use of the Enneagram, a self-awareness tool, which will transform the way that you move forward into the next phase. It'll be a development tool that will impact you for the rest of your life, gives you a perspective on the way that you are and how to break free from those patterns. If you're interested in that, then I suggest that the Platinum package may be for you. Now, this includes the same things that the normal Repotting for Growth does, but additionally, you'll have extra one-on-one sessions, online group sessions with others who are taking the same package, access to any other trainings or webinars that I do during that time, and it'll be over 9 months rather than 6. So your deep transformation will cost you just $697, or you can do an initial payment and then 8 monthly payments after that. So again, here's another quote from somebody else who's worked with me on this one. Jenny said, "I sought out coaching with Helen because I felt unmoored and unsure how to settle well into my new life. The coaching process was instrumental in opening my eyes to my true identity, which gave me direction and confidence for making steps towards how I want to build my life. She helped me figure out what my priorities are, how I am wired, and how I can best contribute to the world." Deep formational stuff. So just as a recap then, there's the Repotting for Growth package, which is a 6-month package, and it's at $357. Again, I can do that with initial payment and then 5 monthly payments. Or there's the Platinum Repotting for Growth package, which is 9 months support and much more deep transformation at $697. I realise this is a big commitment, so if you're thinking that you'd like to take up either of these offers, then the first step is to have a free, no-obligation phone or Skype consultation with me for about half an hour to check that this is indeed the right next step. Neither you nor I want to commit to working together unless we know it is absolutely the right thing. And if when you have your consultation, I don't feel it is the right next step, I'll tell you and make other recommendations. And likewise, if you don't think it's right, then you can say so too. These packages are not right for you if you're not happy to work on yourself towards the transformation you seek and to put in the time to ensure that you get there. So I invite you to email me so we can set up a time to speak. If we agree to go ahead, we'll then arrange a starting time according to when you're heading home and what your plans are. Most people wouldn't want to start in the first few weeks back because life is just very hectic then. but you might be wanting to engage from the word go. So it's very much up to you and your life and how that works. Sessions are likewise fitted around what's best for you, possibly your family, so that you get the most value from them. Now, if you're in the NGO sector, having volunteered abroad, I do have special rates within the NGO sector. So please don't be put off by the expense if you're a volunteer. We can talk about that when we chat. And because I wanted it to make it as easy as possible for you to make this decision, I'm also putting 100% money back guarantee on signing up. If within 2 months of starting work together, you feel it really isn't for you, you can contact me and I will refund you in full. I'm so excited about what we can achieve together that I have absolutely no hesitation offering this guarantee for your own peace of mind. So there you have it. Feel free to email me at the end of this session, or right now if you'd like to book your free consultation. You can even just write your name and email address in the chat box and it will come straight through to me. Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our time together. Congratulations if you feel like you're going away with a plan of action and things to do differently or look out for as a result of the webinar, whether that's by yourself or signing up for more. Has anyone got any questions before we finish, whether about the material we covered in the call or about working more together? I'll stay until all your questions are answered, so do go ahead and type anything in. And any comments are welcome too about re-entry and preparing to go home. I'll just be here for a few minutes, just checking the chat just to see what's coming in and what's been helpful. Okay, I've got a question here from Deborah. You mentioned depression phases twice, both with your husband and yourself. Can you elaborate? Yes, I can. We were told when we came back, that second repatriation, when it was just the two of us that came back, that about a third of expats, when they go into repatriation, about a third of expats will suffer from depression in some sort of shape or form. Some of those won't need medication or further treatment. It will just lift by itself. Others go into a deeper depression. My husband, when we came back that first time of being there together, I think it was very, very stressful, the whole team thing. And I think he particularly suffered quite badly in terms of his relationship with the team leader. A lot of his confidence was stripped. And I think that led to his depression because he was just questioning a lot of who he was and whether he was worth it and things like that. So he was on medication for a while, but he also had some CBT, some cognitive behavioral therapy to help him through. I think it lasted for about 6 months. And then he was slowly able to move on. When I came back this last time, we'd lived through the revolution. We had 2 small children through that time. We had this personal threat to ourselves. We then went through re-entry. Being a mum, they often say that mums can take 6 or 12 months before the culture shock hits because we're so busy sorting our children out and sorting our husbands out and trying to get everything sorted that actually we don't have space to assimilate any of that stuff until later on. And so it hit me at about kind of 6 months in. Actually, no, it might have been less than that. It might have been three to 6 months in, which I would have said is a fairly common time for feeling low. And actually, it was a very, very deep one for me because I think it kicked into various different childhood issues and it did require then medication and therapy for a while. It's by no means common to every repat. If you look on the I Am a Triangle Facebook group, you will find that there's an awful lot of people who talk about being low for quite a period of time when they've gone home and really struggling, and they reach out to people and during that time and say, is this normal? Yes, it is fairly normal. It's all part of that transition. It's part of, because so many things change and so many things move, and because your identity is thrown up in the air, it means that actually it can be really quite tough. And a lot of people do weather that through. They go through a bit of a low patch, typically 3 to 6 months, can be later than that, can be earlier than that. But I would say about the 3-month period, the honeymoon period has kind of waned off. More of reverse culture shock is kicking in. People that you've come back to think, well, you've been back for ages now, so why should there be any issue? And so at that very point where you actually probably need more support, your support wanes. Does that make any sense? So depression, as I say, it can hit about a third of people coming back. It's by no means common to everybody, but I would just say it is there. It is a possibility, and please don't be brave about it. If you feel that you're low at some point during your re-entry, do go and talk to somebody. If nobody else, even your GP, just to say, this is what I'm feeling at the moment. can I just keep accountable or come back in case it gets worse? And your GP should be able to help you to work out what to do with that as well. Doreen says, grace is a great reminder. Yeah, thank you. I think it's so important. Mary says, thank you for the presentation. I'm not in transition at this time. Going to be helping others through transitions. Great. Really pleased that you can take stuff away from that, Mary, then. Good to see how effective this way of a webinar can be. Brilliant. Well, great. I'm glad you've enjoyed it. Any other questions before we just finish up? If you've got no more questions, then do feel free to tail off. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and I do look forward to, oh, I was going to put up the final slide, wasn't I? There you go. Those are my contact details, my website, my email address, the Reentry Stories Facebook group. Do join up to the Reentry Facebook group as you go through your reentry, and let me know how you get on your journey. I'll sit here for a little bit longer in case any other questions come through. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your evening, day, depending on where you are, or if you're listening to the replay, then I hope that's been okay listening to it at a different time, and that you've taken a lot away from that as well. Goodbye all. Enjoy your journey.